Good Wednesday morning. It is episode 45. It is May 27th. Tomorrow's technically our last day of school, so we'll see what I get through on my little 15-minute blurbs. Chapter 27, Mike TV, sent by television. Mike TV was even more excited than Grandpa Joe at seeing the bar of chocolate being sent by television. But Mr. Wonka, he shouted, can you send other things to the air the same way? Breakfast cereal, for instance? Oh my, cried Mr. Wonka. Don't mention that disgusting stuff in front of me. Do you know what breakfast cereal is made of? It's made of all those little curly wooden shavings that you find in your pencil sharpeners. But could you send it by television if you wanted to, just as you do chocolate? Asked Mike TV. Well, of course I could. And what about people? Asked Mike TV. Could you send a real live person from one place to another in the same way? A person, cried Mr. Wonka. Are you off your rocker? But could it be done? Well, good heavens, child, I really don't know. I suppose it could. I'm pretty sure it could. Well, of course it could. But I wouldn't want to risk it, though. It might have some very nasty results. But Mike TV was already off and running. The moment he heard Mr. Wonka say, I'm pretty sure it could, of course it could, he turned away and started running as fast as he could toward the other end of the room, where the great camera was standing. Look at me, he shouted. I'm going to be the first person in the world to be sent by television. No, 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 cried Mr. Wonka. Mike, screamed Mrs. TV, stop, come back. You'd be turned into a million tiny pieces. But there was no stopping Mike TV now. The crazy boy rushed on, and when he reached the enormous camera, he jumped straight on for the switch, scattering Oompa Loompas right and left as he went. See you later, alligator, he cried, and pulled the switch down. And as he did so, he leapt out onto the full glare of the mighty lens. There was a blinding flash. Then there was silence. Then Mrs. TV ran forward. But she stopped dead in the middle of the room, and she stood there. She stood staring at the place where her son had been. And her great red mouth opened wide, and she screamed, he's gone, he's gone. Good heavens, he is gone, shouted Mr. TV. Mr. Wonka hurried forward and placed a hand gently on Mrs. TV's shoulder. We shall have to hope for the best, he said. We must pray that your little boy will come out unharmed on the other end. Mike, screamed Mrs. TV, clasping her head in her hands. Where are you? I'll tell you where he is, said Mr. TV. He's whizzing around above our heads in a million tiny pieces. No, don't talk about that, wailed Mrs. TV. We must watch the television set, said Mr. Wonka. He may come through at any moment. Mr. and Mrs. TV and Grandpa Joe and little Charlie and Mr. Wonka all gathered around the television and stared tensely at the screen. The screen was quite blank. He was taking a heck of a long time to cross, said Mr. TV, wiping his brow. Oh dear, said Mr. Wonka. I do hope that no parts of him get left behind. What on earth do you mean? Asked Mr. TV sharply. Well, I don't wish to alarm you, Mr. Wonka said, but it does sometimes happen that only about half of the little pieces find their way to the television set. It happened last week. I don't know why, but the result was that only half a bar of chocolate came through. Mrs. TV let out a scream of horror. You mean only half of Mike is coming back to us? Well, let's hope it's the top half, said Mr. TV. Hold everything, said Mr. Wonka. Watch the screen. Something's happening. Then the screen suddenly had begun to flicker. Wavy lines appeared. Mr. Wonka adjusted one of the knobs and the wavy lines went away. And now, very slowly, the screen began to get brighter and brighter. Here he comes, yelled Mr. Wonka. Yep, that's him, all right. Is he all in one piece? Cried Mrs. TV. Well, I'm not sure, said Mr. Wonka. It's too early to tell. Faintly at first, but becoming clearer and clearer every second, the picture of Mike TV appeared on the screen. He was standing up and waving at the audience and grinning from ear to ear. But he's a midget, shouted Mr. TV. Mike, cried Mrs. TV, are you all right? Are you there? Are any bits of you missing? Isn't he going to get any bigger? Shouted Mr. TV. Talk to me, Mike, cried Mrs. TV. Say something. Tell me you're all right. A tiny little voice, no louder than a squeaking of a mouse, came out of the television set. Hi, Mom, it said. Hey, Pop, look at me. I'm the first person ever to be sent by television. Grab him, Mr. Wonka ordered. Quick. Mrs. TV shot out a hand and picked up the tiny figure of Mike TV out of the screen. Hooray, shouted Mr. Wonka. He's all in one piece. He's completely unharmed. You call this unharmed? Cried Mrs. TV, peering at the little speck of a boy who was now running to and fro across the palm of her hand, waving his pistols in the air. There he is. Oh, this is terrible. What are we going to do? Well, we can't send him back to school like this. He'd get trod upon. He'd get squashed. Well, he won't be able to do anything, cried Mrs. TV. Oh, yes, I will, squeaked the tiny voice of Mike TV. I'll be able to watch television. Never again, shouted Mr. TV. I'm throwing the television set right out the window the moment we get home. I've had enough television. When he heard this, Mike TV flew into a terrible tantrum. He started jumping up and down in the palm of his mother's hands and screaming and yelling and trying to bite her fingers. I want to watch television, he squeaked. I want to watch television. I want to watch television. I want to watch television. Here, give him to me, said Mr. TV. He took the tiny boy and shoved him into the breast pocket of his jacket and stuffed a handkerchief on top. Squeals and yells came from inside the pocket, and the pocket shook like as the furious little prisoner fought to get out. Oh, Mr. Wonka, cried Mrs. TV, how can we make him grow? Well, said Mr. Wonka, stroking his beard and gazing thoughtfully at the ceiling, I must say that it's a wee bit tricky, but small boys are extremely springy and elastic. They stretch like mad, so what we'll do, we'll put him in a special machine I have testing for the stretchiness of chewing gum. Maybe that'll bring him back to where he was. Oh, thank you, said Mrs. TV. Oh, don't mention it, dear lady. How far do you think he'll stretch, asked Mr. TV. Maybe miles, said Mr. Wonka. Who knows? But he's going to be awfully thin. Everything gets thinner when you stretch it. You mean like chewing gum, asked Mr. TV. Exactly. How thin will he be? Asked Mrs. TV anxiously. I haven't the foggiest idea, said Mr. Wonka. And it really doesn't matter anyway, because we'll soon fatten him up again. All we have to do is give him a triple overdose of this wonderful super vitamin candy. Super vitamin candy contains large amounts of vitamin A, vitamin B. It also contains vitamin C, D, E, F, G, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, T, U, V, W, X, and Y. And believe it or not, vitamin Z. There are only 2 vitamins it doesn't have. Vitamin S because it makes you sick, and vitamin H because it makes you grow horns on the top of your head. But it does have, in very small amount, the rarest, most magical vitamin in them of all. Vitamin Wonka. And what will that do to him, asked Mr. TV anxiously. Well, it makes his toes grow until they are as long as his fingers. Oh, no, cried Mrs. TV. Don't be silly, said Mr. Wonka. It's most useful. He'll be able to play the piano with his feet. But Mr. Wonka, oh, no arguments, please, said Mr. Wonka. He turned away and clicked his fingers 3 times in the air, and Oompa Loompas appeared immediately and stood beside him. Follow these orders, said Mr. Wonka. And you'll find the boy in his father's pocket. Off you go. And he handed them instructions. And please don't look so worried. They all come out in the wash. You know, every one of them. At the end of the room, the Oompa Loompas around the giant camera were already beating their tiny drums and beginning to jog up and down the rhythm. There they go again, said Mr. Wonka. I'm afraid you can't stop them singing. Little Charlie caught Grandpa Joe's hand, and the 2 of them stood beside Mr. Wonka in the middle of a long, bright room, listening to the Oompa Loompas. And this is what they sang. The most important thing we've learned, so far as children are concerned, is never, never, never let them near your television set. Or better still, just don't install that idiotic thing at all. In almost every house we've been, we've watched them gaping at the screen. They loll and slop and lounge about and stare until their eyes pop out. Last week, someone's place, we saw a dozen eyeballs on the floor. They silt and they stare and they stare and they sit until they're hypnotized by it, until they're absolutely drunk with all that shocking, ghastly junk. And oh yes, we know it keeps them still. They don't climb out the windowsill. They never fight or kick or punch. They leave you free to cook the lunch and wash the dishes in the sink. But did you ever stop to think, to wonder exactly what this does to your beloved tot? It rots the senses in the head. It kills imagination dead. It clogs and clutters up the mind. It makes a child so dull and blind, he can no longer understand a fantasy or fairyland. His brain becomes as soft as cheese. His powers of thinking rust and freeze. He cannot think, he only sees. All right, you'll cry, all right, you'll say, but if we take the set away, what shall we do to entertain our darling children? Please explain. We'll answer this by asking you, what used the darling ones to do? How did they used to keep themselves contented before this monster was invented? Have you forgotten? Don't you know? We'll say it very loud and slow. They used to read. They'd read and read and read and read and then proceed to read some more. Great Scott, gadzooks! 1/2 of their lives was reading books. The nursery shelves held books galore. Books cluttered up the nursery floor, and in the bedroom by the bed more books were waiting to be read. Such wondrous fine, fantastic tales of dragons, gypsies, queens, and whales, and treasure isles and distant shores where smugglers rode with muffled oars, and pirates wearing purple pants, and sailing ships and elephants. On cannibals crouching round the pot, stirring away, said something hot. It smells so good, what can it be? Good gracious me, it's Penelope. The younger ones had Beatrix Potter, Mr. Todd, the dirty rotter, and Squirrel and Nutkin and Piglin Bland, and Mrs. Tiggy Winkle, and just how the camel got his hump, and how the monkey lost his rump, and Mr. Toad, bless my soul, there's Rat and Mr. Mole. Oh, books, what books they used to know, those children living long ago. So please, oh please, we beg, we pray. Go throw that TV set away, and in its place you can install a lovely bookshelf on the wall. Then fill the shelves with lots of books, ignoring all the dirty looks. The screams and yells and bites and kicks and children hitting you with sticks. Fear not, because we promise you that in about a week or two of having nothing else to do, they'll now begin to feel the need of having something good to read. And once they start, oh boy, you watch they slowly growing joy. It fills their hearts, they'll grow so keen, they'll wonder what they've ever seen in that ridiculous machine, that nauseating, foul, unclean, repulsive television screen. And later, each and every kid will love you more for what you did. P.S. Regarding Mike TV, we very much regret that we shall simply have to wait and see if we can get him back to his height. But if we can't, it serves him right. Chapter 28, Only Charlie Left. Which room shall we go to next, said Mr. Wonka as he turned and darted towards the elevator. Come on, hurry up, we must get going. And how many children are there left now? Oh, look, like little Charlie and Grandpa Joe. And Grandpa Joe looked back at little Charlie. But Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe called after him, there's only Charlie left now. Mr. Wonka swung around and stared at Charlie. There was silence. Charlie stood there holding tightly to Grandpa Joe's hand. You mean you're the only one left? Mr. Wonka said, pretending to be surprised. Why, yes, whispered Charlie, yes. Mr. Wonka suddenly exploded with excitement. But my dear boy, he cried out, that means you've won. He rushed out of the elevator and started shaking Charlie's hand furiously, and nearly it came off. Oh, I do congratulate you, he cried. I really do. I'm absolutely delighted. It couldn't be better. How wonderful it is. I had a hunch, right from the beginning, that it was going to be you. Well done, Charlie, well done. This is terrific. Now the fun is really going to start. But we mustn't dilly and we mustn't dally. There's even less time to lose now than there was before. We have an enormous amount of things to do before the day is out. Just think of the arrangements that must be made and the people we have to fetch. But luckily for us, we have a great glass elevator to speed things up. Jump in, my dear Charlie. Jump in. You too, Grandpa Joe, sir. No, after you. Nope, that's the way. Okay, now then. This time I shall choose the button we are going to press. Mr. Wonka, bright twinkling eyes rested for a moment on Charlie's face. Something crazy is going to happen now, Charlie thought. But he wasn't frightened. He wasn't even nervous. He was just terrifically excited. And so was Grandpa Joe. The old man's face was shining with excitement as he watched every move that Mr. Wonka made. Mr. Wonka was reaching for a button high upon the glass elevator ceiling. Grandpa Joe and Charlie both craned their necks to read what it said. It said, up and out. Up and out, thought Charlie. What sort of room is that? Mr. Wonka pressed the button. The glass doors closed. Hold on, cried Mr. Wonka. Then wham! The elevator shot straight up like a rocket. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe. Charlie was clinging to Grandpa Joe's legs, and Mr. Wonka was holding onto the strap from the ceiling. And they went up and up and up. Straight up this time. No twisting, no turning. And Charlie could hear the whistling of the air outside of the elevator as it went faster and faster. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe again. Yippee! Here we go. Faster, cried Mr. Wonka, banging the wall of the elevator. Faster, faster. If we don't go any faster, this shall never get through. Through what? Asked Grandpa Joe. What have we got to get through? Aha, cried Mr. Wonka. You have to wait and see. I've been longing to press this button for years, but I've never done it until now. Oh, I was tempted many times. Yes, I was tempted. But I couldn't bear the thought of making a great big hole in the roof of the factory. Here we go, boys, up and out. But don't you mean, shouted Grandpa Joe, you don't really mean that this elevator... Oh, yes, I do, answered Mr. Wonka. You wait and see. Up and out. But it's made of glass, shouted Grandpa Joe. It'll break into a million pieces. I suppose it might, said Mr. Wonka cheerfully as ever. But it's pretty thick glass all the same. The elevator rushed, going up and faster, then suddenly crash. The most tremendous noise of splintering wood and broken tiles came from directly above their heads, and Grandpa Joe shouted, Help! It's the end! We're done for! And Mr. Wonka said, No, we're not. We're through. We're out. And sure enough, the elevator had shot right up through the roof of the factory and was now rising to the sky like a rocket, and the sunshine was pouring in through the glass roof. In 5 seconds, there were 1,000 feet up in the sky. The elevator's gone mad, shouted Grandpa Joe. Oh, have no fear, my dear sir. Mr. Wonka said calmly. He pressed another button and the elevator stopped. It stopped and hung midair, hovering like a helicopter. Looking down through the glass floor on which he was standing, Charlie could see the small, faraway houses and the streets and the snow that lay thickly over everything. And that's where I have to stop today. Oh, I'm over time. Hopefully this doesn't get messed up. Take care, you guys.